So I hang out with the guys every Saturday night, and this last week we talked about shame for 2 hours. That's weird, but some good things came out of it, so I thought I'd share. Okay, so I'm a social worker. In the last few years, Brene Brown has become a really, really big deal. She's a social worker and she studies shame and its effects on people. It's pretty powerful stuff. Here's sort of how her argument goes. Shame is bad for individuals, it prevents us from thriving, and then society doesn't get the benefit of our gifts. Like a lot of people, she distinguishes between guilt and shame. Guilt can be helpful. It's when we hold up our behavior next to our values and we see how they don't line up, and it's uncomfortable. Shame, on the other hand, is this painful belief that we're somehow deeply flawed, and so we're not worthy of love and belonging. It's this feeling that our behavior makes us unworthy of connection with other people. Shame is not helpful or productive. It's the source of destructive and hurtful behavior. It doesn't correct or cure anything, because fear of disconnection doesn't make us somehow thrive. It makes us dangerous. Now here's the thing. Labeling people, especially people who are different than us, who disagree with us, who have different values than us, is using shame to coerce conformity. It's an attempt to force people to agree with you rather than try to win them over. It's a violent tactic. And in our society, it's a favorite tool of both progressives and conservatives. Why do we so readily resort to labeling and shaming? Because it works. It's powerful. Shame is a powerful tool for maintaining order in society. It's one of the primary social functions that has provided stability for civilizations throughout human history. Now, some people like to think if we just educate people well enough, it'll solve most of our problems. That's not a new idea. Socrates said that the person who knows what is good will do good. And sometimes that works. But let's be honest, we frequently know what is good and we choose to do something else. Because ignorance is one problem, but there are others. Our desires don't always line up with what's good for us. And we're prone to putting our own interests above those of the people around us. So when education isn't enough to bring a person's behavior in line, we resort to guilt. We hold that person's behavior up next to our values and we point out where they don't line up, where this person needs to get their act together. And if that works, great. But we all know that sometimes even that's not enough. And that's when we resort to shame. We say to a person, look, if you're not going to line up with our way of doing things, then you need to not be a part of us. You're welcome to come and join us if you change your behavior. That looks like a lot of different things, from exile to shunning, to giving your spouse the silent treatment, to sending your children to their bedroom. But you see, what we've done is we've turned the corner on rejecting a person because of their behavior. And a lot of people are okay with that because it works. Even Brene Brown says that shame can affect people's behavior when guilt fails to. But see, once we're rejecting people because of their behavior, we've made it acceptable to reject people. So substitute in other, more or less reasonable reasons for rejecting people, and now we've got full-fledged discrimination on our hands. Then we notice that there are patterns in the kinds of people who we need to reject. And so that's a convenient way to go about it. And so now we've got social systems and political structures that oppress and marginalize people on a wide scale. Think about the changes that happened in America because of the anti-smoking campaign. Smoking had been promoted as the image of cool for decades. And the tobacco companies were fighting to hide the truth about health risks. So we tried to educate people, get the truth out about the health risks. Nothing happened. Then we tried guilt. Your smoking is harming the people around you, their health. Your secondhand smoke is harming your children. That gained a bit of traction. It wasn't until smoking was recast as a shameful activity that we began to see major changes. Smoking wasn't cool anymore. Dirty people smoke. Smokers have no self-control. They're inconsiderate. They're low class. Suddenly smokers were outcasts in their own communities. They couldn't hang out within 20 feet of the entrances to public buildings. If you want to smoke, that's fine, but as long as you're engaging in that activity, you have a secondary status in our society. Education is powerful. Knowledge is power, we say. quoting an educated European, but guilt is more powerful, and shame is more powerful by far. Only physical violence yields more force in the world than shame does. But notice the phrase we use there, physical violence, because there are forms of violence that are not physical. Non-physical violence comes in 3 forms: intimidation, manipulation, neglect. Shame is one of the most common intimidation tactics. It's abusive, which means there are always victims, and those victims can carry a lot of resentment. Shame sets up a moral distinction between us, who get it, and them, who don't. Shame is divisive, and it sets up a group in opposition. Using shame tactics generates opposition where there isn't any, and it empowers those who oppose you to stand firm against you because you're being abusive rather than trying to win them over. When you hear people complain about political correctness, it isn't usually that they don't want to speak respectfully. The emotional content of their reaction has to do with shaming tactics that are being used to silence people who disagree, who think differently, who have different values. And so even if it turns out that you and your views are correct, your use of shaming tactics alienates your opponents rather than winning them over. And that may gain you ground in the short term, but in the long term, you're making enemies whose anger and resentment run deep. And we Americans can see this happening all around us right now. The use of shame tactics to promote well-being across divides of gender and race and sexuality has yielded Trump-level backlash. Huge resentment. This isn't just a new awakening of racism and sexism and such. It's a movement galvanized by the shaming tactics of progressives. And I'm with progressives on most of these social issues, but they have fueled and empowered this crazy backlash by resorting to bullying tactics instead of non-violent persuasion. And as a result, instead of winning over people who don't understand their point of view yet, we've seen increased violence to minorities and worsened conditions overall. And just to be clear, this use of shame to limit our speech comes from conservatives too. You criticize a president during wartime, you get accused of treason. You have some problems with America's excessive use of military force, you don't support our troops. Shame on you. You don't feel like saying Merry Christmas? You're attacking their freedom of religion. Everyone, regardless of their politics, is prone to using shame as a tool to get what we want. And we always justify that by saying that what we want is what's good for everyone. The gospel has strong things to say about the use of violent tactics to maintain order in society. Peace and order is maintained at the expense of real people. Sure. Maybe it's the victims today who are using shaming tactics, so it's justified, right? That's how the oppressed become the oppressors. It's a pattern we see repeated all throughout history. The cross exposes such tactics as ultimately destructive. Shame eventually leads to violence. The same way a spouse who is verbally abusive will eventually become physically abusive. It happens every time. Look at every important story, from the Gilgamesh epic to Game of Thrones. The great myth is that order is established and protected through violence, and Rome embodied that myth to a T. The famous Pax Romana, the great Roman peace, was maintained through violence and intimidation, and the very public shaming of anyone who disagreed. The very roots of Christian spirituality are in an event that exposed false political peace for the empty violence that it really is. And the response of Jesus to that violence is to expose it and forgive it. After this experience of the cross and the resurrection, Jesus greets his disciples for the first time and he says, Shalom, peace, order. Order comes through the forgiveness of violence, through overcoming violence with forgiveness. That's why so many of the great peace workers of the last century, MLK, John Paul II, Gandhi, Desmond Tutu, have been people inspired by the resurrection. Because in contrast to the old myth of violence, a new story is being told. We will overcome our problems through reconciliation and forgiveness, not through violence, not through shame. Despite what Brene Brown would have us think, we can't simply set shame aside and never engage it. It's part of what holds our societies together. We don't know how to survive without it. But however much good it does for society, it also does real harm to real people. It causes suffering, crushes people's sense of self, prevents human flourishing, and ultimately it robs society of all the good that these people have to offer. So somehow, and I don't have all the answers here, shame needs to be redeemed. We can't deny it, we have to redeem it. How? Here are a few humble thoughts. Shame must only be allowed when it's redemptive. It must be a tool of last resort, used to reconcile, not to condemn. We can only build anything new through reconciliation, and that means nonviolent communication. It can never be used as if one side is right and another side is wrong. It can only be used as if we're cooperating to solve a problem. As long as you see the people who disagree with you as the problem, you will never stop being violent to them. That's all I've got. What do you think? Can shame be redeemed? If not, how do we hold society together? And in the meantime, how do we keep shame from stealing our life? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. I'm hoping we can really figure something out here. And if you happen to share this video on Facebook, well, that's mighty nice too.